GWCs. We're also joined by Paul Eberwine, a PhD candidate in classics at Princeton, who is part of the graduate workers of Princeton and has also been working on various community organizing initiatives in Princeton over the past years, which we'll be learning more about. So thank you so much, and I'll hand it over to Justin.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. It's really great to be here in solidarity with you all. And today I'm here as a representative of the Cops Off Campus Coalition, which is a collection of organizations across the UC system and the CSU system. So we have like dozens of Cal State universities, which are sort of equivalent to sort of like the CUNY system, and then the UCs, which are the 10 research universities. And so we kind of emerged in the wake of the COLA strikes centered on UC Santa Cruz, but that spread to other UC systems, or rather UC campuses, and kind of seeing the ways that the administration sort of both discussed but also repressed student organizing, kind of made it make sense for the organic outgrowth of that organizing to sort of encompass policing. And we sort of link them through an abolitionist ethos, which kind of is both about breaking down the various kind of oppressive structures of the university, whether they kind of come in the form of police officers or deans who withhold stipends, but also kind of using that organizing energy to imagine what a kind of more inclusive and just university might look like. And so I just wanted to take a few minutes to kind of say a little bit more about what we do by talking through this zine we produced last fall. And so we actually kind of begin with the idea that the UC system is emerged out of the settler colonial system based in indigenous dispossession, and actually were quite inspired by Tristan and Bobby's work as we were kind of thinking about how to frame what our kind of positions and interventions would be. And so someone asked a question about universities reckoning with slavery, and I kind of see acknowledging the settler colonial origins of the UC system as a kind of parallel move, because in the same way that a lot of Ivy League universities wouldn't be what they are today without enslaved labor, I think it's very clear, as we all just saw, that universities in the West could only exist through systematic dispossession of indigenous land. And it's not just dispossession in the way that all land in the United States is indigenous land, and so we're all complicit. The UC system kind of goes a step beyond and actually sort of systematically monetized that dispossession through sort of real estate investments, and kind of used the profits from real estate holding companies to kind of fund the early years of the UC system. And we sort of see the system of policing on UC campuses as an extension of the kind of violence and policing that was necessary to secure that initial dispossession, and a way of protecting the kind of investments and expropriations that that sort of built and originated the University of California system. Until very recently, our president was Janet Napolitano, and one can imagine that the only reason a former Homeland Security Secretary, would be a university system president, is to kind of strengthen and secure those kinds of sort of military university research ties. Okay. So one of the things that we kind of think about is that campus policing isn't a kinder, gentler form of policing. It's there's no division between the kinds of police violence that has sparked uprisings across the nation in the past years and what goes on campus. And we really try and push back against the idea that campus cops are benign and are just there to protect students, because most of the incidents of force and violence that the UC Police Department carries out are very specifically directed against student organizing, and kind of it's important to highlight that. We sort of, on my campus in 2011, there was the kind of famous pepper spray incident where a UC police officer pepper sprayed completely non-threatening, passive Occupy protesters, and he ended up actually being the one paid for psychological damages, and our former chancellor sort of was ousted because of her attempt to scrub this incident from the internet and basically kind of try and get people to forget it. In a protest against the UC Regents meeting, similarly, police officers were used against student protesters. In 2012 at UC Riverside, last year at the UC Santa Cruz COLA strikes, it came out that the UCPD was using military surveillance technology at a ridiculous daily expense to kind of clamp down on student organizing. And our new president, Michael Drake, sort of infamously advocated for the prosecution of the so-called Irvine 11 for protesting a speech by Israeli Ambassador Michael Oren. And so when we think about the structure and purpose and history of campus policing, we can see that it's really meant to sort of kind of be the ultimate stick in negotiations with students, right? And to protect the university from the types of reforms and challenges that student organizing might bring about. And so that's sort of where the direct link that we see is between the forms of strikes for better wages and standard of living that UC Santa Cruz and you all are engaged in right now, and the larger structure of policing. And so a lot of what we're doing now, yes, we want to get cops off campus, but we also kind of want to build with all sorts of university movements to reimagine the university, but also with community organizations, because the University of California police have jurisdiction within a mile of all university property. And so on a lot of campuses, that's really significant, right? In UCLA or UC San Diego, that actually kind of gives the University of California police control over a lot of kind of poor and working people's lives when the university is embedded in those kinds of neighborhoods. So it's definitely not just a university issue. This is kind of, it ties into issues of kind of gentrification and buying up neighborhood land, which like Columbia and NYU obviously have been heavily involved in recent decades. And maybe I'll stop there, but that's just sort of a sketch of how we see the kind of campaign to abolish policing as really in line with all sorts of university and outside of university abolitionist organizing.
Great. Thanks so much, Justin, for the presentation. And so now I'll pass it over to Paul to talk.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Paul. I'm an organizer with Princeton Graduate Students United, but I'm also the member of a couple other local organizations within Princeton, including Princeton Mutual Aid and Unidad Latina en Acción New Jersey. I'm going to be talking about the work that some of these organizations do and how they intersect over the course of the presentation that I'll be giving here today. But first, I just want to extend my gratitude for the chance to be here with you all and extend my solidarity on behalf of grad workers at Princeton. As we continue looking forward to our own fight for recognition coming up in the future, the organizing that you're doing here is really inspirational. So I'm really happy to have the chance to talk with you all. What I'd like to say today has a couple of parts. To start off, I'm going to give some background on community organizing in Princeton since the start of the pandemic specifically. After that, I'll offer some brief, more general reflections on the role that community organizing tends to play within our union and how the grad labor movement can effectively relate to community struggles. I don't claim to speak from a position of expertise on this subject. There are other people who have been in these fights much longer than I have. But part of what I'm hoping I'll be able to do is spotlight what other organizers have worked to build over so many years in the hope of showing how grad worker struggles, as you all know, never exist in isolation. To start, some broader context. Princeton, New Jersey isn't exactly known for its vibrant political culture. It's a small, rich, predominantly white town in central New Jersey with one supermarket, but like 5 boutique ice cream shops. Many people, especially students, prefer to think of it as an extension of the university itself. That's how the university likes it. As one of the largest landholders in the region, they prefer to discourage reflection on how their exemption from taxation affects the communities around them. Instead, they choose to treat those communities as invisible. But they do, in fact, exist. They always have, ever since the days when Princeton relied on enslaved labor for its daily operations. The historically Black Witherspoon-Jackson neighborhood has been a part of Princeton for centuries, and in recent decades, the town has become home to thousands of Latin American immigrants. Even today, many members of these communities rely on Princeton for employment. The university, in turn, habitually underpays and exploits them as it continues to monopolize real estate and hoard wealth. Then came the pandemic. Doors were shut, jobs were lost, medical bills piled up. Against this pretty grim backdrop, the university decided to make a very public show of generosity. They pledged not to fire or furlough any of their workers during the pandemic. But if we read the fine print, we learned that this deal did not apply to contract workers, many of whom were abruptly laid off and abandoned by the university after, in some cases, decades of work. Yet another group the university would prefer to pretend does not exist. In the meantime, Princeton pushed austerity on every other front, shoving grads out the door onto a non-existent job market and flatly denying funding extensions they could have easily afforded. Against this backdrop of enormous precarity pretty much everywhere in town, organizers on campus and in town more broadly started talking. In collaboration with other residents, organizers from the grad union, PGSU, played a role in jumpstarting Princeton Mutual Aid, PMA, which has since attracted hundreds of members, distributed thousands of dollars in food and rent relief, and fought really hard for fundamental changes in how Princeton is run. PMA, in turn, began collaborating with Unidad Latina en Acción, a grassroots organization which has already spent years fighting for local immigrant workers and maintains a longstanding commitment to building alternative bases of power which don't rely on the university. Around this time, the new Princeton Anti-Austerity Coalition began organizing a broad coalition of students, undergrad and grad, faculty and staff to push back against the university's sometimes life-threatening policy choices, keeping their effects on the broader community very firmly centered. For months now, all the organizations that I mentioned have been collaborating closely, sharing plans and strategies, and trying to develop forms of solidarity which extend across and beyond campus. To fast forward a bit, all these organizations are now working together as a coalition called the COVID Action Group, demanding that the university extend access to the countless COVID tests, quarantine housing, and medical resources it hoards to the surrounding community, including the city of Trenton. Our most recent protest turned out about 200 people on a snowy day in February, both university affiliated and otherwise, and we plan to keep building from here. But what's been interesting for us within PGSU in particular about participating in this coalition is to notice the ways that these struggles have activated our fellow grad workers who hadn't previously been involved in the union in some cases. When we sit down to talk with potential new members, we find that people are already aware of how the university is failing the people it claims to support, grad workers and otherwise. Now that the path to win recognition for our union seems a bit clearer than it was before the last presidential election, many of our colleagues are substantially readier to fight than they were in 2019. And a major part of that shift has to do with the way that coalition-based community organizing has changed the political climate on campus really sharply, I think, over even the course of a single year. This is to say, whatever success our union has in the future will be a product of the work that's been happening in the broader community over the past year. And we hope in turn that we'll be able to use our position as a union to continue highlighting the countless points where the interests of grad workers and those of our neighbors align, particularly the importance of holding the university accountable for the longstanding racist exploitation of all of its labor forces, and the importance of forcing them to listen up for the first time in their lives, as all of you are doing here today. Throughout this process, the best way to coordinate efforts between the union and other organizations with overlapping but distinct memberships and priorities hasn't always been clear. It can be difficult to know how to balance the fact of our specificity as a grad worker union with the desire to participate in the broader political currents around us. We've had to experiment with committee structures, and it's taken time to build up stable channels of communication, as well as long-term working relationships with all the other organizations in town, which is all to say that this is still a work in progress. But I don't mean to call what we're building so much a perfect model for coalition-based organizing as an exciting place to begin. Exciting from my perspective, because it's done a lot to reinforce something we'd always accepted in principle through experience, namely that our struggles as grad workers intersect materially with those of the communities around us, and that the more that our organizing centers those intersections, the easier it is for us to build power within our workplace. We count Columbia grads as one of those communities we intersect with. We're really fired up by the work you all are doing and really grateful for the chance to be with you here today. I'll drop some links in the chat that describe some of the efforts that I've been talking about, including a link to the petition that we're pushing for the university to extend access to COVID resources along the lines that I mentioned. If you might be willing to take a look and sign, it would be really appreciated. But other than that, I think I'll leave it here for now and look forward to the conversation.
Okay. Thanks so much, Paul, for talking about all of the organizing and the work that you and your colleagues have been doing. These are both, I think really great and inspiring examples of how to organize on and off between, in this space of the university that is in fact, extends much farther than we thought. And I think maybe to connect to the previous presentation, we're learning through this how much the university as an institution does to configure relationships of power and inequality far outside, its footprint, and that its footprint in fact extends into the cities, the towns, and the regions that it's a part of. And so that maybe it is our obligation as organizers within the university to also think about how we're organizing within that much broader space. So I want to open it up to, questions, comments. I know in this group, I'm sure we have people who are organizing in many other arenas. We had a really kind of amazing tenant organizing effort over the summer for folks that live in Columbia University housing, which is also people who are not Columbia University students, but rather have Columbia University as their landlord. So, yeah, people can drop questions in the chat or raise their hand using the raise hand feature. I can start things off with a question for both of you, which is, maybe in the kind of most basic sense is, how do you start to build these connections and sustain and maintain them? I think like one of the kind of issues with, and this might be different in the case of organizing with faculty, but one of the issues with even organizing within our unit is that like students kind of come and go, and I imagine that it's important.
Sorry, the law says you have to have your mask on
Okay.
unless you're eating or drinking. So now you're drinking. And you can have it off.
Sorry, I'm in a public place and should be wearing a mask. So, how do we kind of create and sustain relationships, even as, oh, okay, I'll just keep it on. Even as, people are moving through these systems, the university systems.
Sure, I can try to speak to this a little bit. Yeah, one of the major obstacles that we ran into was the lack of existing institutional memory about how these connections have operated in the past, not just with the union, but also outside of it. Community organizing has been happening, of course, in Princeton, as in, pretty much everywhere for many decades, but there wasn't much of a standing record of how those organizations have intersected with organizing that was happening on campus. Because, as you say, people move in and out of the university, and it's tough to keep track of relationships like that. So, I think one of the things that was most helpful to us at the start was to try to plug in with people who have been around for a much longer time than those of us have on campus, and particularly getting connected with local churches that had served as kind of nodal points for a lot of activism in the community for many decades and centuries in some cases, was a particularly helpful way to not only get a broader sense of how our efforts fit into a larger trajectory of organizing in town, but also to start making connections with members of the community who don't go on campus very much and who we probably wouldn't have been able to talk to otherwise. So I think that's one part of it. Another part of it has just been doing what we can to, talk with alumni to facilitate broader sort of networks that integrate the knowledge of people who have already passed out of the university space, and do what we can to be sort of deliberate about compiling those resources in a form where we hope we'll be able to transmit them as the years go on. I think the thing that's a little bit nerve-wracking about some aspects of pandemic-related organizing is the fear that it's going to be ephemeral, that after the pandemic's over, it's going to be tough to maintain the connections that have been forged with the same kind of stability that they might have now once the immediate urgency of the moment of crisis is past. And so I think coming up with reliable long-term modes of communication, trying to archive documents, and trying to be really deliberate about talking to people who are just getting involved about the things that have came before is going to be an essential part of trying to keep the momentum of this current moment going when we've passed out of it. So yeah, it is very difficult, but it's also been exciting to be a part of.
Yeah, so I've just turned my camera off because I'm trying to manage a very neurotic dog and just kind of keep him calm. But this is a huge challenge with university organizing. But I think in some ways it shows how important working with staff and the community is, because people who live around a university are probably there for longer than students. Staff are oftentimes there very long term. And so those relationships can be a really important way of preserving institutional memory, because there's much less turnover with those groups. And another thing that all of this has made me realize is that I actually had very little sense of what the university kind of budget and power structure looked like. So, I think there's obviously a kind of ethical grounding for demanding cost of living increase, living wages for all staff and students. But at a practical level, understanding the budget and sort of the reasons why people are making kind of austerity arguments against those increases was really helpful, right? And that's sort of another way that we connected sort of policing to grad student labor, right? We saw that even in the wake of the Black Lives Matter protests over the summer, at most UC campuses, the policing budgets were actually projected to go up. Right? So there's kind of a budgetary argument there. And also just kind of thinking about how learning more about how the university structure works and what the kind of pressure points are, right? Like who exactly is it who's authorized to make these decisions? What role does the faculty senate play? And depending on that role, how important is it to kind of build broad-based faculty support versus kind of undergraduate and staff support to kind of make your coalition so kind of broad and deep that it sort of becomes unthinkable for the administration to not accede to your demands? Or are you kind of targeting a particular kind of office or sector in the administration itself if the power is highly concentrated there? I think these kinds of organizing campaigns are a really important opportunity to kind of think about our theories of how change happens and to kind of enact them, right? What exactly is the process by which your demands can become reality? And that, yeah, just sort of personally for me, that's been really challenging to kind of work through. But definitely a place to start and kind of to keep information on how budgets work, how the university power structure works for future kind of generations. So it's not always starting at ground zero after a cycle of students has moved on.
Thank you, to Paul and Justin for those answers. And I think that, exactly as you're saying, understanding, the many different groups, constituencies, allies that we can be working with is really important. I see that Berenike has a question that she said she would ask.
Yeah, thank you first of all so much for organizing this and for your presentations and sharing about your experiences. That's really helpful to hear. I post my question in the chat, and I'm just really curious about your experiences and thoughts about kind of collaborating with elected officials and candidates for office, especially as some of the things you've been talking about, like policing, or also I'm thinking about gentrification and real estate and property. All these things, they really link to local and sometimes state politics too. And so I'm curious both about how these relationships can be maintained also outside of strikes, and what it can look like in a way that is most beneficial also for the communities. So thinking not just about what it, kind of the benefit to those officials or candidates and also to, for example, us as we're striking, but really how this can be thought of more sustainably as we're kind of collectively trying to improve conditions on campus and off campus. Thank you.
Sure. I can respond to this based on some of the experiences that we've had in town, dealing with local government in particular, members of the city council, things like that. I think one of the important things to keep in mind when negotiating these relationships is that while elected officials are often capable of helping in important and material ways, with the policy ends that we're advancing, there's also limitations that we've run into pretty sharply in terms of how far many of them tend to be willing to go, in terms of yielding to pressure from organized community power. And so I think the sort of technique that we've had to work out as we went along, but which I think has generally worked pretty well, is to try to maintain and cultivate those relationships at the important strategic points where elected power can usefully advance the material interests of the coalitions that are organizing, but also to bear in mind, or to keep a firm sense, I suppose, of the objectives that we have in dealing with elected officials, so that organizing doesn't wind up kind of subtly reorienting itself towards asking people for things that they often aren't going to be willing to give, but keeps itself in the register of the demand. That isn't always easy, particularly because the layers of bureaucracy that tend to be implicated in dealing with local and state government elected officials can be so sort of enveloping that it can be easy to kind of lose track of a broader horizon, and it starts to feel like that's what's out there in terms of pursuing avenues of change, part of which, of course, is intentional on the part of the people who design and maintain these systems. But I think, yeah, the thing that we found important is that even when we send in requests to elected officials, as we do to university administrators all the time on various campaigns, that the escalation plan that comes next usually doesn't include them in the same way. And balancing those two aspects of our organizing and our advocacy, I think, has allowed us to maintain strategic relationships and alliances where it's helpful, while also trying not to lose track of, I suppose, the effective and practical limits that we can sometimes run into when relying on those avenues of support.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was a really amazing response, and so I'm not sure I have too much to add, except you know, to say that it really depends on the local conditions. Like I kind of am of the mind that you know, Northern California has a reputation for being very progressive, but even the so-called progressive local elected officials are, you know, hugely kind of captured by the real estate industry. And you know, since we are funded by the state, there's also always that kind of austerity background, and so it kind of seems unthinkable in a way to not only kind of ask for your funding not to be cut, but also for all of these XYZ demands. And so it kind of feels like they aren't a particularly useful set of allies in our case. But I think that again really depends on local circumstances. I mean, I think does the mayoral primary in New York offer an opportunity to try and kind of give some of the progressive candidates an issue to sort of prove their chops? Is there a way to kind of manipulate or benefit their desire to be seen as properly progressive by kind of getting them to support your campaign in a way? I think it's all very contingent, but I totally agree with Paul in terms of the sort of potential pitfalls of long-term relationships. And I sort of see the benefit as elected officials can sometimes really embarrass university administrators with just a comment or a tweet or something. And that can be a really maybe useful tipping point in making the university sort of see the social costs of refusing your demands outweighing the kind of financial and political costs of kind of going along with them. That's sort of the set of questions that I would bring to this question.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. And I think, I don't know, good points to think about, especially as we're trying to reach out to many elected officials and public officials kind of in this moment. So it's good to have this in mind of how to kind of think about those asks and those relationships. Are there any other questions anyone has? I mean, I guess while people still like gather their thoughts, maybe one thing I was thinking about, kind of listening to this last response is, is kind of coming up in both these struggles. I think against this rhetoric of like what is impossible, in a sense, like even I think after the summer and Black Lives Matter and facing the realities of police violence, I think that, there's still this sense of like, well, defunding the police, it's just in so many levels impossible because of the needs of safety and security, or like with COVID and university budgets. I mean, this is something that like, we come up against is like, well, it's just like the university is losing money. Like we just can't do this. And I mean, I think in other contexts, this mask, it's like super annoying. In other contexts where I organize that, kind of against militarized surveillance, like, you're just kind of up against this argument that like the needs of security are just so paramount that you feel like, okay, how to push back against this, how to make inroads against this. So I guess I was like, to both of you, wondering kind of when faced with this, this rhetoric of how to start to push back and make inroads against these stances of what can and cannot be changed.
Sure. Yeah, this has been a particularly interesting experience, I think, for a lot of the organizations I've been involved with in organizing in Princeton, which, as I said, is not necessarily a place associated with a lot of really sort of radically oriented political culture. And so I think precisely for that reason, it's been all the more surprising to see a lot of these grassroots efforts sort of carry themselves forward, not purely on their own energy, also through the efforts of a lot of really committed organizers, but with a lot of a pretty kind of surprisingly large groundswell of support from the people within the community. And I think part of that has been showing how the pursuit of the kind of apparently impossible goals that you're describing is sort of coextensive with the daily experience of reality, living in this town and dealing with this university, that a lot of people have already been experienced. That as lofty as goals like the university subjecting itself to a democratic mechanism of control in the way that it distributes COVID resources, which is something that we've been pushing for, as abstract as that might seem to somebody who hasn't been involved in organizing campaigns or things like that before, when sort of facing the concrete urgency of the fact that they invited back thousands of undergraduates into the community without soliciting that community's permission, that the choices that a small handful of administrators make on the top have a material, immediately recognizable effect on people's daily lives, suddenly those goals tend not to feel so abstract anymore. So I think Princeton Mutual Aid in particular has done a lot of really effective work in tying together pursuits that might feel abstract or impracticable with the kind of bread and butter realities and struggles that people have in town to feed themselves, to get rent paid every month. And by tying together organizing on those fronts, by doing that within the same group, by organizing for food distributions, rent relief campaigns, while also pushing for, pretty serious campaigns of reform in the way that the town and the university are run, they've been able to sort of concretize and demonstrate, I think, the connection between these multiple levels of experience that I think was implicit for a lot of people in the town, in a way that activated a lot of energy, which particularly people at the university, I think a lot of us weren't really sure was there before. So yeah, I think finding ways to tie in the kind of concrete struggles of everyday life with which people are familiar with the broader organizing goals that might not seem immediately accessible on the level of strategy has generated some really cool results and is something that I've learned a lot from.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's such an important question, and the kind of position we've taken is to be, you know, sort of uncompromisingly abolitionist, and to not work with people who take a more reformist stance. And so, you know, every UC campus has proposed a task force on policing that sort of proposes to reimagine what policing looks like, and, you know, promising to reform some of the policies that lead to you know, violence against students and community members, but we sort of don't engage with that and try to delegitimize it. And I think the kind of the way we negotiate is to sort of do like sort of agitprop and kind of propaganda when it comes to delegitimizing administration positions, but then also kind of really producing materials and creating spaces to explain why demands that seem impossible are actually very common sense and necessary to you know, broader community members. And so we we organize what are called coffee not cops sessions, where we just sort of have, you know, masked, socially distanced coffee sessions where we kind of just you know, offer people refreshments and have kind of materials about abolition, and sort of talk to them about what we're doing and why we think it's necessary. And I think that kind of the translation of something that seems very self-evident and necessary and obvious to those of us who are kind of directly involved in a campaign, and kind of making it making it feel equally accessible and common sense to the kind of broad-based community that we hope to gain the support of, is sort of equally as important as kind of pulling apart and breaking down the kind of administrative arguments for why they can't do something. So not kind of compromising on the impossible position, but also sort of not making the assumption that it's kind of self-evident to everyone.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. Any other questions?
I have another question I would love to pose. So I've been curious in general about the role of kind of visions and hope, and imagining what we would want the university to look like, or the communities we live in to look like, and so on and so forth, and its role for organizing and alliance building. And I'm curious if you can speak about that, like the extent to which you've used that or focused on that in your organizing, what that has looked like thinking not just about the things we don't want to see, which I think for many of us are clear, but really what a different kind of work or community or, you know, collaboration would look like, neighborhood, you know, whatever the issue is. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it can be really tricky, particularly when dealing with a moment of, you know, emergent crisis, to kind of break away from the register of the negative, of just pointing out what's wrong with the situation as things are, as you're saying, and try to imagine a sort of alternative order of things that might take its place, given that those kinds of leaps of imagination take a lot of energy when you're stuck in a pretty depressing, violent moment in the present. And I think that's part of what makes it tougher to do that kind of exercise individually, to imagine sort of new way that your community might look on your own, when a force like Princeton University has such a monopolizing, totalizing control over that kind of existing way that things are. It can be tough to sort of break out of that. And I think that's an area where just developing communicative platforms that bring together hundreds of people as different efforts are, highlighted and flagged and organized around in the various WhatsApp chats and, organizational meetings that happen. Finding ways to keep those organizations distinct while allowing a certain degree of fluidity between them has meant that imaginative exercise that you're talking about has become much more collective and collaborative than I think it would have been for any one of these organizations in isolation, or for any of us as individuals on our own. And the product of that, I think, is that suddenly, as we were saying in response to the last question, the apparently impossible or the apparently abstract has started to feel attainable or reasonable, or like it's part of the reality that other people are living to, part of the vision that other people are working with. And I think that that kind of work of collective imagination has done a lot to break through, the kind of sense of immediate atomization, isolation that's come with the historical circumstances that we're living in too, where a lot of people are kind of stuck on their own, dealing with really material problems and not able to connect with other people as organically as they used to be able to, which I think really does have a material political effect too, the isolation that a lot of us are dealing with over the course of the pandemic. And so, yeah, I think, I don't want to pretend like it's all media. That's the answer here. But I do think developing ways for people in different sectors across town and in the university who are not previously in contact with each other to begin the work of imagination together has unlocked sort of possibilities of radical re-envisionings of the future that would not have been nearly so easy to think of a year ago, and has made that kind of thought work into a collective process into which it's a lot easier to feel integrated than it was before. So I guess coming up with discussion platforms, things like that, that allow for that work to be collective, organic, as fluid and broadly spread as possible, has energized a lot of us who were pretty tired and pretty drained before that was happening.
Yeah, I think kind of shifting the terms of debate from kind of absence to presence, or what you want to get rid of to what you envision for the future, is really productive in a lot of ways. If you just ask someone in a campus community, like, do you think we should abolish the police? Their knee-jerk reaction might be no, but if you reverse it and say, what do you need to feel safe and secure? Very few people are going to say like guns or police. They'll talk about kind of housing security, food, sort of feeling like your family or community members are kind of protected in certain ways. And then that kind of sort of can really shift the debate from one about sort of budgets or the impossibility of thinking about a campus or a city or a world without police to actually what does security and safety mean in more substantive ways. And it opens up the discussion to questions of sort of living wages, sort of housing security, and takes the discussion of security away from just sort of whether or not you have cops to all of the other things a community needs to kind of be secure. And it is really difficult to do in isolation, right? If any of us were just sort of asked to imagine like a post-capitalist world or whatever on our own, it's kind of trickier than it sounds. But if you do it as a collective project, that's sort of where really important community building happens. And so I think helping people who can't imagine a world without the thing that you are kind of working against, see what it might look like, is an important point, is an important way of kind of inviting people into whatever project you're working on. And also it's an important exercise for organizers themselves.
Can I also add just one more thing inspired by Justin's last comment about inviting people into the work of the sort of vision work? that he's talking about. Yeah, I mean, I think another part of this has also been creating venues for kind of shared and collective grief in some ways, given the amount of that has been accumulating right now. And sort of offering collective platforms for that grief to be transformed, beyond rage, and often through rage, into a politically efficacious force. Um, uh, where workers are able to describe what's happened to their families since being fired at the start of the pandemic and being unable to put food on the table, in a way where other people share some part of that grief, pain, rage, and it becomes channeled in turn towards people who are able to do something about it. And at that point, along the lines that Justin is discussing, the question of what's wrong with the way things are right now turns into the question of what it would take for them to be different. And that kind of collectivization, I suppose, of at least part of the burden and the pain of, the way that things have been arranged up to this point, allows a much greater degree of freedom, I think, and sort of vitality in undertaking exercises to create something different and something new. So I think allowing a lot of space for the kind of critical force of grief and rage to come together and sort of organically coalesce into something that moves forward towards something new and different has been a really powerful organizing tool. Sorry, that just came to mind as I heard Justin talk.
Yeah, thanks for that. I see that Ava has a question for Justin. Maybe Ava, do you want to just say your question?
Sure, happy to. Thank you both so much. Justin, I might have missed this, and then I'm sorry if I did, but have you been able to include the Cops of Campus issues in union negotiations at the UC since it's coming out of the COLA strike? Or is this movement building kind of happening mostly off the bargaining table? It'd be great to hear more about your successes and or struggles here. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so the timing has been a little bit tricky in the sense that UC Santa Cruz was the first and most successful of the campus unions who went on strike. And the others who followed suit in solidarity a little bit later kind of, they sort of ended without positive resolution for two reasons. The first was that these were not actually union authorized strikes. They were wildcat strikes. And so it was really difficult to get it was really easy for a certain type of community or faculty or administration member to dismiss the strikes because of that so-called illegitimacy and just sort of disengage. And sort of as those discussions were happening, that's sort of when COVID hit and we all went remote. And so sort of at the very moment that students were kind of deciding whether to accept sort of being like basically kicked out for refusing to grade, that's when we sort of shifted online. And so I think there was kind of a sort of pause on those efforts as people were just sort of scrambling to figure out kind of questions of health and survival. And that was the last spring. And then in the summer, were the kind of most recent wave of protests and uprisings when these questions of defunding and abolition came to the fore a little bit more. And so far, I think the other non-Santa Cruz campuses haven't kind of collectively returned to the question of a strike for all sorts of reasons. But I think it's a possibility that kind of broader questions of safety and security could be folded into future efforts. But I think it's also one thing I learned was to not kind of make assumptions about the politics of graduate students in my community, right? I sort of sent some information on an action to my department listserv, and a few students really pushed back hard, and it was kind of an eye-opening moment, and it was productive to kind of engage with their concerns, but it also made me realize, okay, this maybe isn't a common sense leap or continuity for a lot of people, and that it might take work to kind of pull them together for the majority of union members. But yeah, that's a really great question.
Thanks for that question, Ava, and for the response, and yeah, and for reminding us also of the work of also kind of explaining our political positions as a kind of work of educating and sharing. Are there any other questions from anyone? Comments? All right. Well, if not, I see that it's almost 1 p.m. And I know that bargaining starts at 1:30, so maybe like a little bit of a break would be welcome. So I hope everyone can join me in thanking Justin and Paul so much for your work, for coming and sharing it with us, and your solidarity with our strike. Thank you both so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much.
All right, great. Well, I guess I can let you both log off, and I'm not sure if people want to stick around on the Zoom for more phone banking or hanging out or whatever. All right, I actually have to run, so I'm gonna sign off. I'm not sure if there's like something that is supposed to be happening in this half hour.
I don't think we have anything like officially scheduled, but it's definitely a good opportunity to do some more admin blasting, and also reach out to faculty about the letter to support our demands on real recourse, which is now in the doc that I shared just now in the chat. But also a good opportunity to get some food and go to the bathroom and take a sec.